All right, we're going to go to Isaiah in West Virginia. There's no pronouns given. He says that they say that eyewitness testimony is reliable in certain circumstances. So, Isaiah, what do you want to talk about?
Oh, yeah. How are you today?
Good.
Good. So I do believe that eyewitness testimony is trustworthy depending on whose eyewitness testimony it is and how well you know that person or their reputation.
Okay. Are you a Christian?
So, I am.
So presumably you take Paul, I guess Paul wouldn't be an eyewitness, but do you take Paul's testimony or someone else's as trustworthy in that landscape?
I would see Paul as a trustworthy character.
Okay. If you're like, who's somebody that you know that you really trust, like your wife, like you don't have to give them your name, but do you have somebody that you really trust, like directly to you right now?
Yeah, like my mom, cousins, brothers, stuff like
Great.
that.
If your mom came up to you and said they saw the risen Elvis or like the risen Tupac or something like that, right, and it changed their life, and they think that it like unlocked some secret to the universe, they understand like the fundamental nature of reality, would you believe your mom just because she's really trustworthy?
I wouldn't necessarily believe her just from her claim, but I would definitely consider it without just rejecting her because of my trust for her. I would know that if she did come to me and say something like that, she must have seen something, or maybe it really did happen, but I would have to look into it.
You're skeptical, right? Yeah, you'd have to look into it. It's a good answer. You have to look into it. But you don't know Paul, right? You're 2,000 years removed from Paul. What makes Paul so special? Especially somebody who didn't know Jesus.
Well, even people you don't know, like let's say you're reading an autobiography of just anybody, nobody specific, but as you're reading this person's autobiography, you come to realize, like, from their life experiences that they share and kind of how they handled certain situations. I'm not saying that everybody, is capable.
How do you know? How do you know that? Because 7 of the 13 Pauline epistles are forgeries, right? So how in virtue of what are you basing this trust off of? Like, you've never met Paul, right?
I guess just comparison.
Well, that was a question. That was a question. Have you met Paul?
Oh, no, I haven't.
Yeah, so how do you know Paul said any of those things? Like, there's one question about whether or not you can trust Paul, which is a whole other thing. But like, how do you even know? Like, are you aware that 7 of the 13 Pauline epistles are forgeries, not written by Paul?
That's of Paul's epistles. I knew Hebrews was questionable. Some people believe it's Paul's, but no, I've never heard anything about 7 of them being forgeries.
Well, I'm going to pass it to Cross here in a second because I don't want to take a lot of time. I want to come back to this, but I want to kind of give you where my head's at. Like, you don't know Paul. You're 2,000 years removed from Paul. It's unsure whether or not Paul wrote what is stated in the epistles, right? Like, in fact, I read a lot of scholarship. I'm very confident that it's either 6 or 7 of those are not written by Paul. They're written in Paul's name. And even a lot of Christian scholars agree with this. Given that, and in the case where you were going to investigate with your mom, in the whole Tupac being risen kind of thing, I think that that's a proper investigation, right? Like, oh, okay, she said this thing. Let me look into that, right? Let me make sure that this is true before I accept it. But with Paul, you just have something telling you something that's true, right? You didn't see the resurrection. You're just reading words on a page. So I'm not like seeing why you trust that when there's so much divorced from that experience than your mom directly telling you about this experience. But anyway, I'm going to get your thoughts on that, and then Cross, if you want to come in. I don't want to hog it.
Oh, sure. Thank you. Yeah, I would say it's not just dependent on solely Paul, but there's other people from his time that are spoken of in the Bible that had met him and vouched for him, and those are people that, at least the way their characters are described and the way I can understand them, they seem trustworthy also. I guess there's no way to know for sure ever. It's just that's why it's trustworthy, I guess. You have to trust them in some way, but
I don't know that we've established the trustworthiness. This is what I'm getting to. But Cross, what are you thinking about this so far?
Well, I think this is a common. I will classify it as a slight misunderstanding. And Isaiah, forgive me, I want to make sure I understand what your call-in point was. I think your initial point was that you believe that eyewitnesses can be or are usually trustworthy. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes, that they can be.
Okay. I think they can be in certain circumstances, but as somebody who's in the legal profession where you deal with nothing but eyewitnesses all day long, I can tell you that eyewitnesses tend to be the least trustworthy form of evidence that we have. There's many reports and documents and studies that have been done to demonstrate how untrustworthy and how unreliable eyewitness testimony is. I'll give one example. There was a documentary that was done, I think about 10 years ago by Nightline or Dateline or somebody, one of the lines, one of those news programs where they had a hidden cameras in a professor's class. There's about 100 students 50 feet away from her watching her lecture. They had an actor play a robber who came in, guy wearing a black pullover, pulled his hat off, looked around at the class for about 5-10 seconds, then grabbed her purse and ran out the door. And some students tried to give chase and they stopped them and said, no, don't worry. Security will take care of it. If you graphed their description of height, weight, eye color, hair color, race, all of these attributes on a graph, it was a cloud of dots. Nobody agreed on anything. They all agreed on one point, that he had a weird looking nose. So they started interviewing all of these people and they brought out the actor, and the actor had a totally normal nose and nobody knew why they thought they had a weird nose. They replayed a video of what happened, and the professor who was in on this, once the class settled down, as an aside said, wow, he had a weird looking nose. But anyway, let's keep talking about what we were talking about. And every student, almost to a man, would have testified under oath that he had a weird nose. One person was so adamant that it was right that they had to bring the actor out, and the guy was still pointing at the nose and saying, see, it's a little curved here. So I think that speaks to how wrong we can be when we're eyewitnesses and how adamant we can be when we really believe something. But I would encourage you to sort of question that underlying premise that eyewitness testimony is regularly reliable. If it can be reliable, but you can only be reliable once you have other factors established, then we don't need the eyewitness testimony. We just go to the other factors, like what is the actual documentation? What is the actual evidence from DNA or anything like that? And my final point is, we don't have any eyewitness testimony in the Bible as far as I'm aware of. We have no eyewitnesses. The Bible itself is hearsay from a legal perspective.
Yeah.
I could not admit the Bible into evidence at trial if I was trying to prove, if I was admitting it for the purposes of proving what the Bible says. The defense attorney or whoever opposing counsel would object and say that's hearsay.
Maybe hearsay, yeah.
Yeah, and I would try to sneak it in under a rule called ancient documents exceptions, which is designed for objections to this hearsay rule, and I might or might not succeed. So I wonder what your thoughts are on that, of questioning the premise that you came in with, which is eyewitness testimony is reliable.
Well, as far as other historical events or time frames that we try to find evidence for, it's based on a lot of eyewitness testimony and records of letters and similar things that
not the Bible.
We see. The Bible's
do you think that Mark wrote Mark?
No, I don't. The authors are technically anonymous, and Mark and
Matthew, they're anonymous. The disciples spoke Aramaic, and the writers of the Bible were highly educated in Greek, right? And so there would be some type of high, like, aristocrat in that area. That's how, like, you learn that from like an early age when you're being able to, if you could write such a literary text.
But let's ask him again. Like, I don't think he answered my question, which is, what do you think now about eyewitness testimony after hearing just that one example of 100 students 50 feet away that got a good look at this guy for 10, 15 seconds, couldn't identify the guy. And this is within a 30 minutes to an hour after the event, whereas the Bible, we're talking about the earliest books are written a generation after the events that they're talking about. So what do you think about the reliability? Is there any, I guess the question is eyewitness testimony a relevant topic when we're discussing Christianity at all?
I believe so, and I understand the factor of influence. So, like, it's easy for a large crowd of people to be influenced, especially by somebody that they respect, even if it's not necessarily a true statement that they're coming to believe or internalize, or whatever the proper phrasing is for it. But I think as far as the Bible goes, it's important to consider that this is Jewish people in a time where religion was extremely important. So they would have been very cautious of their moral stance whenever giving testimony like this. So I
don't see why you have any reason to think that. I mean, one thing, there would be no purpose of a trial by jury if eyewitness testimony was just like reliable, right? Just like Cross is saying, like, we would have we would just go ask, what happened? He did it. Okay, great, book him, right? That's what we would do. There would be no need for a trial by jury. And so it's not this is flawed, even if you think that eyewitness alone is going to be good. And Cross did a really good job at explaining that. Two, just for any of these other reasons, like I mean, I'm going to be doing grand jury. And so, like, if it was just as simple as they did it, right? I wouldn't be needed, right? There wouldn't be any point of like evaluating the evidence and looking at it, right? So I guess I'm a little concerned that you're really hung up on the eyewitness testimony stuff, but let's just start there. What eyewitness testimony do you have?
First, I'd just like to say, in their time, they relied heavily on eyewitness testimony for trial and for disputes.
I'm not saying we don't rely on it. I'm saying we can't solely rely on if we just use eyewitness testimony, there wouldn't be a need for trial by jury. There wouldn't be a need to looking at more evidence. We would just be like, okay, they did it. Okay, great, thank you.
I wouldn't base my faith solely on just what I believe are eyewitness testimonies. But I would base it on other things also, like just personal testimony, revelation, stuff that I felt was from God. But, other people might hear it and think it was emotional.
Do you believe in Bigfoot?
I believe there's
a lot of eyewitness testimony there, apparently.
Yeah.
Yeah, but so it just seems like you're arbitrarily picking like things. I don't see like how you're getting from, even because you haven't cited what the eyewitness testimony is. And then you've agreed with me that the text is anonymous and Paul didn't know Jesus. What's the eyewitness? I don't get it.
So Paul, his testimony, his epistles, they were to the churches of the time, and they were about things that he personally had witnessed, but also about ways to...
Did Paul watch Jesus resurrect from the dead?
No, but he claimed that he experienced an encounter with Jesus, basically.
Okay.
And I believe that people...
You trust that he had an experience. So he goes around persecuting Christians, but maybe potentially has some kind of like post-traumatic type of vision of Jesus, feeling really guilty. And you want to say that because there's a story about such an event or him writing about it, that lends credit that the content of what he saw was true? Because I don't get that, right? Like you're just looking at this statement from Paul and going, okay, yeah, that must have been true. He must have saw what he actually saw. There's no investigative work there. You've just accepted his testimony on it. And he's not even there, right? He's after the fact. I'm not seeing like in how you're confident in the quote unquote eyewitness when it seems like you're conceding that there isn't an eyewitness. I mean, can you name me one eyewitness to Jesus's resurrection?
I can't name an eyewitness but I would say that the anonymous.
Then why do we trust it?
Four Gospels were witnesses.
Wait, you think that the Gospel writers were witnesses?
Yes, I believe that the Gospel writers.
It's not. Luke 1:1, the prologue in Luke literally says, "Your excellent Theophilus, many of us have taken to put an orderly account. I am here to give you an orderly account." He's casting aspersions on earlier accounts like Mark, right? He's telling him directly that have been passed down to us. Luke is clearly not an eyewitness. Mark is, I mean, the disciples spoke Aramaic. They're said in Acts, John and Peter are said in Acts to be unlettered, that they can't read or write. So John clearly couldn't have written John, right? Because he was Aramaic, unlettered Aramaic speaking Jew that didn't know Greek, which is what the Bible's written in. So what eyewitness?
Well, the Jews for about 200 years had been kind of intermingled with the Greek language at that point. So that a lot of them did speak Greek, and there's never
no, they didn't
recall anything written that they didn't know how to read or write, but that
90% of people in antiquity at that time couldn't read or write, let alone write they might be able to write their name, but they couldn't write a literary text such as the Bible.
I've got a different question for Isaiah. Isaiah, correct me if I'm wrong, Jmike might know this, but correct me if I'm wrong. The vast majority of Christian scholars who study the Bible agree with Jmike that none of the Gospels were written by who they are named after. They are all anonymous, and none of them were eyewitnesses. The earliest that was written, I think, was Mark around 70 AD. So 40 years after the death of Jesus is when this is first put to quote-unquote paper, as to speak. So would that influence you if I told you that the vast majority of Christian scholars agree the Gospels are not eyewitness accounts? Does that hold any weight with you? That's just a question. Does that hold any weight with you? Does that convince you that maybe they are not eyewitnesses? Because everybody on that side of the aisle, so to speak, agrees that these are not eyewitness testimonies, but you seem to be saying that they are, or that they could be, when the experts who have studied this, devoted their lives to studying these documents, would disagree with you.
Luke is most likely, the author of Luke most likely is believed to have pretty much went around and collected eyewitness testimonies to formulate his gospel.
Okay, so it sounds like we're changing from saying that they are an eyewitnesses to they spoke to eyewitnesses. So they are not eyewitnesses themselves. I could not put Luke on the stand if I were an attorney and say, "What did you see?" He'd say, "Well, I talked to so-and-so, and they said that so-and-so saw something." Immediately, hearsay. There's a reason we, through thousands of years, decided that hearsay is unreliable, so that we can't admit it. So the Gospels are not eyewitness testimony, but maybe what you're saying now is that they spoke to eyewitnesses or friends of eyewitnesses or something like that, correct?
Yes, for Luke's circumstance, yes. But like the Gospel of Mark, Mark was a scribe, I believe, is what most of the scholars agree that the writer of Mark was a scribe named Mark. And
no, they
he
don't.
was believed to be under Peter.
Peter gave ramblings at no, because they don't. Mark is just a tradition that's given in the 2nd century. I don't know. It's I think it's the 2nd century is when you get the 2nd or 3rd century is when you get that tradition. Read Mark. Does it ever a point where Mark says, "Then Jesus said to me, then I said to Jesus, then me and Jesus went fishing by the lake"? Never. It's in 3rd person. It's clear as day. Now, it was an argument that there's literature that's written in 3rd person. It may be, right? But if you're talking about this being an eyewitness to one of the most important things in history, it's not going to be written in such a literary text. You're going to be saying, look, then Jesus said to us. Then I spoke to Jesus and asked him. Right? Mark refers to him, there's people that are referred to in the book by their name and not by saying me or I, right? I mean, they're not even pretending to be eyewitnesses.
Well, you're correct in that it is, so excluding John, the other 3 Gospels are written in 3rd person kind of format, I guess. but it's most likely to exclude ownership over the gospel itself. They don't want to make it about themselves, and when they do mention certain disciples by name, it's usually for a lesson or a specific reason, because that will be important later, because like Judas, he was the one that betrayed Jesus. So they kind of, it seems like the authors are careful about how they incorporate their own person into the stories.
I don't know how that's true if you're wanting to say they're putting Mark on the front cover. Like how does that stand when they want to take themselves out of it, but then it's like the gospel according to Mark, the gospel according to Matthew? That just doesn't fall. Like you have to pick one lane or the other. And what I'm trying to tell you is that the authors aren't even pretending to be eyewitnesses, right? Like Luke is very clear on that. I'm glad we got that out. But you go read Acts, right? Read Acts. It tells you that Paul is unlettered. The Greek word that is used means that they can't read or write. I looked it up the other day, right? I talked to a scholar, Captain Dadpool, who's been on, or he's a historian, I guess. I don't want to butcher his title. I talked to him specifically about this, who's been on the show. If I can use your own text to show that someone's unlettered, it's really strange when that person kind of comes back to me or wants to deny that. Because now we've ruled out John. He couldn't have read or write, let alone like, even if we could say he could write like a sentence like, hey, what's up? I believe that Jesus said this thing to me in a very basic sentence or something. Okay, that's great. But writing a literary text like the Gospels with like these themes and when you read Mark and you have this whole theme that nobody understands Jesus the entire time until the Roman centurion who crucifies him and then says that this is the God, right? As soon as this is the Messiah. As soon as the curtain rips, right? Nobody who couldn't read or write would write such a literary text like that. They wouldn't be able to.
Correct.
So it just
it's also important to consider that the Christian community of the time was very diverse in I guess the peoples that it would bring in their skill sets. So some were fishermen like Andrew and Peter and James and John, and Levi was a tax collector, and you have Paul, who was a Pharisee. So he would have been reading the scriptures, and that would have been most of his work and studying for his early life. And it was very diverse.
Appealing to Matthew is not going to help. 93% of Mark is in Matthew. Matthew just copied Mark and made changes, right? There's 93% of Mark is in Matthew, and then there's things that are changed, like king to tetrarch, right? There's a birth story, right? There's all sorts of things in there that are added that felt important to Matthew. It's more indicative that they weren't satisfied with the account of Mark, which is why I'm saying in the prologue of Luke, I think that's what the author of Luke is doing. He's casting aspersions on Mark. It's not a satisfactory account, right? Hence why you get this virgin birth story and all that, and you get more additions. But I'd urge you to, we're going to try to get to some other callers, but I'd urge you to look at what scholars actually have to say about this in terms of the eyewitnesses. And when you have like Matthew as some tax collector, and you want to cite that as well, he might be able to write or read Greek a little bit. Well, even if I granted that because of his profession, he could know a little bit of Greek, there's a giant difference between knowing a little bit of Greek and being able to write some sentence down versus writing a literary text. And then there's just a massive distinction There's a massive underpinning here that when your own text expresses that people are unlettered, that it's going to be really weird to go to John where Jesus is Superman and be like, all of a sudden, he just got to studying and learned how to write a literary text such as John, right? That's so unfathomable to me. But I don't know. I'm gonna let you get the last word, and then we're gonna let you go on this.
Well, I appreciate your guys' time, and I hope I could help you guys get a good conversation in today. But
you've been a nice guy. I apologize if I got a little heated.
No, I totally agree. I was going to make sure that Isaiah, you heard that. I really appreciate your call. I think that what I hear listening to it is somebody who is if you'll forgive this, I don't mean this to be an attack in any way. It's a place that a lot of people are, where we started the call with eyewitnesses' testimony can be reliable. We then came to an agreement that these people are not eyewitnesses, so it's kind of irrelevant to the discussion. But even then, you started sort of looking for ways to say, well, they could have talked to people and they were kind of educated in some cases. That seems to be sort of thrashing around a little bit, looking for an excuse to hold on to that core belief. But you could just accept it. And I think you maybe are moving in that direction to say, okay, we don't have eyewitness testimony. Where does that leave me? And then you can have another discussion. And I would encourage you to consider thinking about that, because we all have mistakes. We all have misunderstandings. Once you are corrected on it, and I subcontract my understanding out to Jmike and the academics who tell me, no, these are not eyewitnesses' testimonies, and we don't know who wrote these. Once we've accepted that, we can then have a different conversation. So I would encourage you to consider calling back once you've thought about it.
Okay,
I really appreciate it.
I will do that.
Yeah, I appreciate the conversation, Isaiah. I think you were a very respectful caller, so we do appreciate that. Apologies to you if I got heated. It was nothing directed towards you, but I would like for you to call back and see what you think next time. Maybe we just get in the exact same spot that we did, but maybe not. Maybe we make progress.